Good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you all for coming out tonight. It's so good to see a positive turnout to a conversation discussion that's obviously critical to our community and the future of it. So I really appreciate seeing a strong turnout to engage in this for the future of our community. So it's obviously the continuation of the conversation that started last year on Shearwater. And it's my pleasure tonight as the mayor of the city to be here and help MC and moderate the proceedings and the evening discussion. And that's what it is. It is about a discussion, it's about information, and it's about a conversation for us in guiding and help to move our community forward in the future. And what for all of us, the passion for the city of Dawson Creek and how we make sure that it moves forward in a responsible and prudent and effective manner that works for all of us as residents. And over the last, for me, as the last 7 or 8 months as the mayor, I think the critical thing for me that is important for all of us is we make our best decisions if we have information and we share that information and gather that interaction in our community to help us guide that decision-making process. So tonight isn't about making a decision. Tonight's about information and sharing some of the information that's been developed since the survey process and the interaction that took place in 2013, and now carrying that forward this year with some further information that's been developed as a result of that interaction, the surveys, and the public discussions and meetings that occurred last year on the issue of the water for our community. So we got members of council here tonight. That we got the North Central Local Government Association meetings going on in Fort St. John yesterday, today, and tomorrow, which involves all of the municipal governments from 100 Mile House North and out to the Charlotte. So we got some members of council, including all of us who were up there yesterday, today, and again tomorrow, that appreciate Councillor Kenny and Malkinson and Parslow coming back tonight for the meetings. We obviously have the administration staff, Kevin and Shelley and Jim, here this evening to follow through on some further information that they're going to do and do some a presentation on the information that we wanted to bring forward in this next phase. We got Chelsea, who's here, and in order to guide the interaction, she's going to help us out with a microphone for anybody that wants to engage and help us with that. So with that, I want to first step up. We're going to have Kevin Henderson, the Director of Infrastructure for the city, is going to give a presentation on some of the technical components from our water infrastructure, and then followed that will be Shelley. And this is about the financial information and implications that were part of that flow out from, that's a good term, that flow of information from last year in terms of the financial implications to this discussion. Al Madashaw, did you call me you're worthless? He does. And so with that, and obviously Jim Shute, our Chief Administrative Officer, and here to be able to help guide us with that technical information that we need. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Kevin, who's going to start. We obviously want to engage in the discussion, so if you have questions, please feel free to put that up at any point, and if you have questions during the presentation, then, like I say, stick your hand up and we'll engage in that process. So. Again, thanks for coming out, everybody, tonight. We appreciate it, and with that, I'll give it to Kevin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. So just a couple of housekeeping items, just so you know, you all may know, washrooms are just over here. The order of the panels when you come in, start there, work this way, over to here, go back that way, and please ensure that you've got your survey information. Fill them out, either paper copy or there's the kiosk in the back. You can do it digitally as well. So obviously we'd really like your feedback. good. Off to a good start. So as the mayor touched on a little bit, our goal for tonight is really to recap what we talked about last year and the outcomes, and present a little bit more updated information on some of the things we've learned since then. And Shelley's going to provide us a little bit more information on the funding scenarios, and then really to gauge support for all the new information that you get tonight. Can you flip the next one there? So looking back at last year, the discussion we had, at that time we were looking and kind of presented 4 different options. One being looking at the existing system, basically status quo, just with regular upgrades. Another was looking at building a raw water reservoir just west of town to provide more storage. Another one was to explore looking at groundwater aquifers and the potential with those. And lastly was the looking at a new pipeline to a new source, whether it be the Peace River or Murray. So this chart outlines a little bit of those 4 scenarios and some of the implications with them, and the population projections that they can support. And you'll see there, ranging anywhere from 16,000 upwards of 32,000 people with a new pipeline, the associated costs, and whether they, provide waters in time of drought. Okay. So what we heard through the survey, and we had awesome response last year. We had more than 1,000 people, which is just great, through the online and the printed surveys and the telephone poll. What we heard was more than 2/3 of the people were in favor of a new pipeline to the Peace or the Murray. Okay. Some other information that we got out of the survey is that more than 80% of those who provided feedback opposed the use of fresh water for fracking, and more than 60% supported increased public education and about water conservation. So just a little bit about what council did in response to that is, water conservation bylaw was amended, which now prohibits the use of fresh water during times of drought for industrial use. New policy that directs any future industrial operations to use of the reclaim plant, and policy around prohibiting any additional private truck fills. So we have some in town, but the policy would change that to no additional ones. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over to Shelley, and she's got a lot of information on the funding analysis.
Thanks, Kevin. So Angela, I actually have where you switch the slides because some of the information, does that work now? Okay, so I'll just say slide and then you can switch it. So thanks to everyone for coming tonight. It's really a big decision and some really important information. As Kevin mentioned, approximately 2/3 of those residents surveyed last year felt that the city should build a new pipeline. So based on that support, council passed a resolution for staff to look at the financial implications. Specifically, the resolution stated that staff prepare a report on the funding of a pipeline to the Peace River using 3 ballpark figures for the project: 55 million, 75 million, and 100 million. The report should address the borrowing capacity of the city, taxation, water utility funds, impact on other infrastructure needs, possible application of fair share funding, operating costs, private sector partnerships, and any other factors staff believe important in helping council come to a resolution of this issue. My job tonight is to share the financial information from that report so that it will help you with your decision making. The report does not cover everything, nor does it look at the costs of a pipeline. It explains funding options, risks, and the related impacts to the residents of Dawson Creek. Right now, we do not know with any certainty the true cost of a pipeline. Engineers would have to complete design drawings first, and a preferred route would need to be determined. The report, therefore, is a combination of a what-if analysis and a cost impact analysis. That is why 3 different figures are looked at. Regardless of which cost estimate is used, this project will be very expensive for the community. And right now, the city does not have $55 million in the bank to pay for it. Because the project carries a high price tag, it brings with it a high degree of risk and complexity. Moving forward with it prematurely could stress the financial resources of the city and the community, depending on the final cost, especially those families on fixed incomes and small business. To give you some context on the magnitude of the project, a few comparisons were made. So if the project cost $55 million, that would be about 1.3 times the cost of the city's total water system infrastructure, or 4.3 times the city's average annual capital spending. However, if the project cost $100 million, that would be 2.4 times the cost of the city's water system, or just about 8 times the average annual capital spending. Also, building a pipeline upgrades the supply system, but there will also be changes needed to the treatment facilities, pumping systems, and distribution system. Slide. So as I mentioned before, the city does not have all the money right now to pay for this project. In 2013, at the time the report was written, there was about $16.5 million in the bank, but much of this is for current operations and other capital commitments. In 2013, the city's capital budget was about $21.4 million, and the operating budget was about $34.4 million. So this project could be significantly higher than our total consolidated budget. Slide. So there are many ways to fund a capital project. One funding source can be used, or a combination of many. Before beginning a capital project, however, the funding must be secured and included in the city's 5-year plan. Regulation, permitting, borrowing authorizations, and multiple agreements make the process of establishing appropriate funding for this type of a project a lengthy and complex one, possibly resulting in cost increases throughout the process. This happened with both the Multiplex and the Calvin Crook Arts Center projects. For both of these, additional funding had to be secured after the project started. However, because we are still paying for these projects, securing additional funding may be more limited for this project. So paying for a pipeline or any other project, there are 2 basic ways to pay for something. Use your own money or use somebody else's. These 2 ways apply to local government spending just like they do for a personal financing decision. Affordability needs to be considered, and although it is subjective and based on one's own particular financial circumstances, it is important to consider this because the community and its residents will be paying for this project. When looking at a personal financing decision, there are a number of questions that should be considered. Do we have the money to pay for it? Can we save or borrow the money to pay for it? How long will it take? Will we have to give up something while we save or pay back the borrowing? Maybe the federal or provincial government will give us some of the money. Maybe we can work with a private company to share costs. Is there a cost to getting the money? What is the current interest rate? Is it likely to change? Can we afford to do this right now, or should we wait? And are there any less costly alternatives? Going through these questions gives some context to the process and should be considered before moving forward with this project. So to look at saving. Determining how much to save annually would be dependent on whether other sources of funding could be secured, and secondly, how quickly council and the community would want to proceed with the project. Slide. The impact to you, the resident, will be dependent on how fast we have to save and where we get the savings from. In the report, we explored 3 examples. Cut services and put the money saved from not providing those services into a reserve. Levy a special tax and put the money into a reserve. Or use tax money from growth in the assessment base and put the extra money from that into a reserve. Now, there probably are many other possibilities, but these were the 3 that were analyzed in the report. Slide. So let's look at cutting services or reallocating fair share. First, we can look at saving money by cutting services from the operating budget. For example, if council chose to cut the operating budget by 5%, 1.7 million could be saved annually and put aside in a reserve. This example would take about 32 years to save $55 million. Alternatively, if the project cost $100 million, it would take close to 60 years. On the other hand, a higher cut of 20% would raise $7 million annually, and then saving the entire amount would only take 7 to 14 years, depending on if the project costs $55 million or $100 million. The higher the cut, the faster the increase in reaching a specific savings target, but the impact to residents is also higher. Where to cut and how to cut would also have to be decided upon, and that would be a lengthy process the council would have to undertake with the community. Cutting budgets in contracting economies is a common strategy for reducing spending because revenues are declining and activity is slowing. Reducing budgets in growing communities can be more difficult because activity is increasing and expanding infrastructure is needed to support the increased activity. Reallocating fair share and or any other general fund revenue to a water fund capital project or reserve has a similar effect as cutting service, because essentially the general revenue used in the fund is gone. This method of transfer is simply reprioritizing spending from the general fund service programs to water capital projects. The money to pay for the existing service level would have to come from taxation, otherwise the service would have to be cut. Allocating specific dollars from one fund to another does not change the total funding envelope, it just changes the spending priority pattern. Slide. So alternatively, council could decide to hold services at their present level and impose a special annual tax levy to save the money. Right now, the residential rate is $5.16 per $1,000 of assessment. And again, the time frame used affects how much the annual levy would need to be. For example, an annual residential tax levy of $2.07 per $1,000 of assessment would be required over 10 years to raise $55 million using the current tax ratio model. If the project cost $100 million, then the levy would increase to $377 per thousand per year. If, however, the time frame was over 20 years, then the impact is less, but over a longer period of time, as shown in the table. Right now, the commercial to residential tax ratio model that is used is 2.66 to 1. Therefore, the levy on commercial properties would be about 3 times as high as the residential impact. Slide. So in dollar terms, the increases could range from $312 per year on a $55 million project, $423 per year on a $75 million project, or $564 a year on a $100 million project, all for 20 years. And if we wanted to save the money over 10 years, the annual increases would be higher. Slide. So another option is to look at increasing infrastructure water rates. Presently, the city uses a funding model that allocates revenue from the water infrastructure charge to borrowing costs or capital upgrades, whereas the variable water charges fund operational costs. In 2012, approximately $1.5 million was raised from the infrastructure charge, and this allocation would have to remain in place to pay for existing commitments. If the same savings model is used as in the other examples, then the impacts are still significant. The analysis shows the impacts on a typical 5/8-inch home connection. To save $55 million over 10 years, the annual infrastructure charge would need to be increased by $564 from $222 to $786. However, to save the same amount over 20 years, the charge would increase by $171 per year and go from $222 to $393. Slide. Alternatively, if the project cost $100 million, then the charge would increase as high as $1,217 per year on a 10-year model or $493 on a 20-year model. The current billing base is close to 5,000 customers. Increasing the base by adding customers would lower the impact, which would be the case if council looked at a regional cost sharing model. Slide. So another option is to tax growth. One of the reasons people believe that this pipeline is needed is to accommodate growth. So looking at an example of how much growth is needed to raise the annual amount without affecting the current budget model provides council with some useful information. If we use the 10-year savings model, the current residential and commercial assessment basis would need to increase 40% to raise the annual savings to fund a $55 million project, compared to a 73% increase to generate the annual savings on a $100 million project. Alternatively, a 20-year savings model needs a 20% increase on a $55 million project compared to a 36% increase on a $100 million project. And it should be noted that the lift needs to occur at the front end of the funding model and must remain stable for the entire 10 or 20-year savings period. So if we look at the city's annual historical growth since 1999, it has averaged about 10.4% on the residential base and about 14% on the commercial base over the last 14 years. These increases are significantly less than those needed to support the savings model just discussed. Also, no one can predict with any certainty whether these levels of growth will continue. The oil and gas industry is dependent on commodity pricing, which is dependent on global supply and demand markets, and although they affect the community, they are beyond the city's control. Slide. So now we'll look at borrowing the money. An alternative to saving is borrowing, and borrowing is often used when savings or other funding sources are not available or in combination with other sources. This option is more costly because of attached interest costs. In 2012, the city owed $29 million in outstanding debt. The annual principal and interest payments on this debt are approximately $4 million. In 2013, council committed to borrowing an additional $11.3 million for road upgrades, the Loran Reservoir, and the sewer trunk line. So this brings the committed outstanding balance to about $40 million. Based on the committed balance, the annual principal and interest payments will increase to approximately $5.2 million. The city's borrowing capacity limits debt payments to 25% of ongoing revenues, including fair share. Also, the limit changes every year as revenue increases or decreases. In 2012, the limit for the city was about $10 million. So this is really important to note. If fees and or charges are increased, the city is allowed to borrow more. If fees and/or taxes are decreased, the city is allowed to borrow less. If fair share revenue increases, the city is allowed to borrow more. However, if fair share revenue decreases, the city is allowed to borrow less. Because debt payments are fixed for a term of the borrowing, 20 years, there is significant risk if revenues decline. Taxes and/or user fees would have to increase to pay for the difference if no other sourcing were available. Comparing the three estimates to the borrowing capacity limit shows that a $55 million project can be accommodated. However, borrowing for a $75 million or $100 million project would put the city in an over-the-limit position. These scenarios are based on funding the entire project with borrowing, and most often other sources of revenue are combined as part of a total funding envelope. If the city borrowed to its maximum capacity for this project and future revenues decline, then the city could be in an over-the-limit position. This would mean that the city would be unable to borrow until such time that revenues increased or existing borrowings matured. It is unlikely that the ministry or the public would give their approval to this kind of a borrowing because of this risk, unless it was absolutely necessary to do so. Also, City Council approved a debt management policy in August 2011. This policy sets an internal limit on annual debt costs to 15% of annual revenues, but unlike the provincial limit, it applies to individual funds first and then on a consolidated basis. The policy provides a type of early warning indicator that says if debt servicing costs reach the 15% threshold in any given fund or on a consolidated basis, then the city should slow how much it borrows and/or stop borrowing for a while and wait for some of the existing debt to mature. This provides a flexibility contingency for declining revenues. The city has already reached the 15% internal limit in its water fund, and fees may need to be increased in the near future depending on other sources of revenue. Slide. So presently the city operates under the policy that the water fund is a self-sustaining fund. This means that revenues within the fund must pay for all the expenditures in that fund. Fees and charges are set at a rate that combined with other revenues will pay for operating costs, debt servicing costs, and future capital. The 2013 water fund budget is approximately $5.5 million, including $2.5 for operations, $1.1 for annual debt payments, and $1.9 for annual capital and reserves. The outstanding water fund debt is about $8.2 million, with annual payments of $1.1. The balance will not be paid off until 2027, so 14 years in the future. In the last few years, the water fund has been supported by the sale of potable water for non-potable use. This revenue source is dependent on fracking activity, which can be unpredictable. New regulation and new technologies are being put in place to change this industry use, so it is likely that this source cannot be used in a funding model because it is not stable or secure. Slide. So 2013 operating costs for the water fund are approximately $2.5 million, including $506,000 for treatment, $1.4 million for distribution, and $643,000 for supply. Building a pipeline will significantly increase supply costs. However, the impacts to distribution and treatment are not as determinable. The highest operating cost increase of a new pipeline will probably be the power for pumping. Currently, the city pays approximately $1 million for all its electricity. Based on current hydro rates, power costs for the new line are estimated between $1 million and $1.7 million. Future increases over the next 5 years are expected and could be as high as 26%. These increases would add significant cost pressures not only to the water fund, but to all city services. Also to be considered are the additional cost increases from added maintenance and staffing to manage a bigger system. Slide. So other levels of government often cost-share projects with local government. Dawson Creek has been quite successful in the past in this regard, securing funding for the multiplex project and the Calvin Crook Arts Centre, as well as numerous other water projects. More currently, however, because of a slower economy, both federal and provincial levels of government are more selective in choosing where project money will go, as well as the amount available. No costing analysis is provided using other levels of government as a source of funding because the uncertainty of getting them is too high. The city also partners with the regional district on many services, such as fire protection, 911 dispatch, recreation, and waste management. And investigating a regional partnership is certainly an option. Another source of funding to consider is from private sector partnerships. This is often done for large projects in large communities. They are often very complex to administer, and ownership of the asset often remains with a private entity. Funding for the water reclamation facility was carried out in a private sector partnership with Shell Canada. The difference, however, with that project was that the city retained ownership and operation of the facility. In exchange for the funding, they were allowed to connect a pipeline to the facility, and the city is committed to the future delivery of effluent for 10 years. This was a very unique project because there was very little impact to the residents of Dawson Creek. The major cost of the facility is being paid by the delivery of a product we didn't have before. If we apply a similar funding model to the pipeline project, then some sort of exchange would be required because private companies do not give money away. There must be some value in the exchange. Slide. So in summary, the city could pay for the project by saving or borrowing or investigating alternative cost-sharing models using sources of funding from federal and provincial programs or from public-private partnerships. Slide. The analysis I just explained provides some exploration into different funding models for a new pipeline. Many more are available and may have to be considered and explored if council and the community decide to proceed. Regardless which model is chosen, there are probable impacts, such as increased fixed and variable water charges, increased taxes, reduced operational and capital service spending so the pipeline can be paid for, possible decreased growth, increased financial stress, increased corporate and community risk. Presently, the community and the corporation are experiencing enormous change. The pace of development is stressing existing infrastructure and the businesses and people who manage it. All levels of government are under increased scrutiny to keep costs low and affordable for taxpayers, but cost pressures of maintaining failing infrastructure keep rising. The uncertainty of climate change and future market volatility further stresses current systems. Increased regulation often makes everyday managing much more complex, and finding and keeping qualified people to manage business operations in this environment is getting harder and further exacerbates the situation. This is a big project, and it will need to be paid for wholly or partly by the taxpayers of Dawson Creek. Wanting a pipeline versus needing a pipeline needs to be evaluated very closely because the residents of this community will have to pay for it for a long time. Thank you.
Population projections. When we talked last year, we were using a 2% annual growth rate, which we knew at the time was fairly aggressive, but we thought it was prudent to use a number like that during a growth period such as we're in. What that calculated out is that, you know, we would be able to support 16,000 people, and it would take till about 2024 before we reach that. But what we're hearing now through BC Stats is that they're predicting a lower rate, 1% annual growth, So what that means is that could potentially stretch that limit of 16,000 people out to about 2034. So it gives us more time, if that holds true, to make decisions. Slide, please. Another important piece of information that we've gained over the last year is out in the watershed, and more specifically Bear Hole Lake. We've been doing a lot of monitoring, engaging out there, and as well as some releases from the lake into the river to gauge how it responds, and pleasantly surprised to see how that lake responds. What we're seeing is that we can withdraw out of the lake, and the lake is recharging very quickly. So what that means is that's giving us more comfort and more drought resiliency, and much more confidence in the system overall. Bear Hole Lake has about 200 days worth of water stored up there, and if it's going to recharge fairly readily, that means we're able to manage the system maybe in a different way than we have in the past. Okay, next slide, please, Angela. So next steps with why we're here today. So what we'll be doing over the month of May is we'll be compiling the survey information that you have in your hands or that you've already filled out. We'll be doing another telephone poll. So if someone calls you, I encourage you to participate in that. All that information will be gathered, compiled in a report the same as it was last year. By the end of June, we'll have that information. From there, council will have to make some decisions based on what that says. So really, those outcomes we don't know yet. Council will make some decisions. If the residents are saying we've got some time, we don't need to do anything right now, we'll plan accordingly. If comes back saying we think we need to move sooner, then council may look at doing some engineered studies, designs, so we can get a better fix on what the actual costs of the pipeline would be, because we would have to come out to the public again with tighter numbers, more specifics, and ultimately the public's going to have a vote on this if we move forward. So again, remind you, please have your say on this. Fill out your surveys, whether it's on paper. There's drop boxes here. If you want to go home, fill it out, bring it back. There's drop boxes at City Hall, the library, the pool. We've got the kiosk back there. You can go on the website, fill it out electronically. If you want to come and visit me at City Hall, I might even give you a free pizza. Take one home, fill it out there. That's right.